Have you ever noticed how your mind doesn't stop, even when everything around you is silent? How insistent thoughts come back, repeat, accumulate, and seem stronger than their own will? What if the biggest problem in your life is not outside, but inside you, hidden in a place that no one sees, but that controls everything you feel, decide, and live? There is a battle going on right now, silent, constant, and maybe you are fighting without even realizing it. It is as if the mind creates scenarios that never happened, fears that have no form, memories that do not rest. You try to ignore it, you try to distract yourself, but it comes back. It comes back when you wake up, it comes back when you go to bed, it comes back when you need peace the most. And little by little, this steals his strength, his clarity, his faith. The most unsettling thing is that many of these voices sound like yours, as if they were part of you. But what if they are not? There is something that almost no one notices, something ancient, profound, hidden in the pages of the Bible, but which has always been before the eyes. A silent principle, a spiritual key that not only calms the mind, but transforms it completely. It is not something complicated nor distant. It's closer than you think, but it remains invisible to those who have never been taught to see. What if I told you that there is a way to silence this internal chaos without running away from it? That there is a way to reorganize your thoughts, to bring clarity where there is confusion today, and peace where there is only pressure. It is not an empty promise. It is something real, tested, lived by those who have learned to access this secret, because there is a spiritual code, simple in appearance but powerful in essence, that can completely change the way your mind works. Something that God has already revealed, but that few really apply. And when this is activated, everything starts to change, from the inside out. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12:2. If you stick around to the end, something inside of you will begin to align in a way that you may never have experienced before. It will not be just understanding, it will be transformation. And perhaps, even today, her mind will finally find what she has been silently seeking for so long. And that's exactly what you'll start to notice from now on. Along this path, you will discover how God works in the mind in a quiet but profoundly transformative way, using real stories that reveal principles that still work today. You will understand how thoughts can be mastered, how emotions can be aligned, and how peace can exist even in the midst of chaos. As you continue, something inside you begins to awaken, as if each word is reaching areas you couldn't explain. And maybe that's no coincidence. If this message has already started to touch you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this simple gesture can take this word to someone who needs it right now, just like you. Now it begins to become clear why everything you experience on the outside seems to be born inside you first. Before any decision, before any attitude, there is a silent thought that forms, grows, and gains strength, and it is exactly in this invisible place that the real battle takes place. The Bible reveals something profound, something that often goes unnoticed. The fall of man did not begin with an action, it began with an idea. A subtle, almost imperceptible suggestion entered my mind and completely altered the way of seeing reality. There was no physical force, there was no imposition, there was only a distortion of perception. And this continues to happen today, even more silently. Thoughts arise as if they were your own, but not all of them are. Some carry fear, others doubt, others make you feel incapable, insecure, distant from God. And the most dangerous thing is not the thought itself, but when you start believing in it. Because, little by little, what you accept in your mind begins to shape your emotions, your choices, and without realizing it, your destiny. For as he thinketh in his soul, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. This means that your mind is not just a place of passage. It is a ground where seeds are being planted all the time. Some come from God, bringing peace, direction, and clarity. Others come to confuse, weaken, and divert you from the purpose. And if there is no vigilance, these seeds grow. They create patterns, they create cycles, they create invisible prisons that seem normal but are actually taking you away from the life God has planned. Maybe now you're starting to notice something you didn't see before. That voice that says, you won't make it. That constant worry that doesn't let you rest. That memory that insists on coming back. None of this is by chance. There is an origin. There is an intention behind it. And understanding this completely changes the way you deal with your own mind. Because controlling the mind is not trying to stop thinking, but learning to identify what deserves to remain and what needs to be rejected. This is where a deeper level of spiritual awareness begins, where you stop being a hostage to thoughts and start having authority over them. And when this starts to happen, something inside you reorganizes itself. Confusion begins to give way to clarity, the weight begins to come off, and peace, which seemed distant, begins to approach in a real way. If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, perhaps it is because God wanted you to hear it today. Don't ignore this touch on your heart. If you felt something, write in the comments. Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of a big change. There is a silent but decisive difference between an ordinary thought and the voice of God within the mind. And if you don't learn to recognize this difference, you can spend your whole life confusing direction with doubt, impulse with purpose, fear with warning. Not every thought that seems true comes from God, and not every strong feeling carries the right direction. That's why so many people feel lost even though they're trying to do the right thing, because they've never been taught to discern what they're hearing inside. The Bible shows a profound moment, almost forgotten by many, but which reveals exactly this process. A young man named Samuel heard a voice, but he did not know where it was coming from. He thought it was someone calling, until he understood that it was God speaking to him. At first, there was confusion, there was repetition, there was doubt, until finally he answered in the right way, "Speak, Lord, because your servant hears." 1 Samuel 3:10. This reveals something powerful. God's voice does not always come in an obvious way, but it carries characteristics that set it apart from any other thought. God's voice does not generate despair, even when it corrects. It does not bring confusion, even when it confronts. It aligns, organizes, illuminates. While other thoughts quicken the mind, press on, create urgency and fear, God's voice brings a quiet steadfastness, a peace that does not depend on circumstances. The problem is that the mind, when it is full of noise, cannot perceive this difference. There are so many voices, so many opinions, so many memories, that everything seems to be mixed. And in this state, the person begins to act on impulse, to react without clarity, to decide without direction. But when the mind begins to be spiritually trained, something changes. You start noticing patterns. He begins to identify when a thought does not come from God. You begin to feel when something inside you is misaligned. And that changes everything. Because, from that moment on, you no longer react automatically, you observe. Discernment becomes more important than responding. And in this space between thought and action, God begins to manifest himself more clearly. The mind ceases to be a place of confusion and becomes a place of encounter. Maybe you felt that at some point, that peace that didn't make sense, that certainty that didn't come from any logic, but that deep down you knew was different. That was the voice of God. And the more you learn to recognize, the more that voice becomes clear, constant, present. If this word is awakening in you a deep desire to hear him, comment right now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." Write it as an open prayer, a door of faith. And please like this video. You'll be helping more people learn to recognize Master's voice. There is something that many people avoid without realizing it. Silence. Not the outer silence, but the inner silence, where thoughts fade, voices cease, and the mind finally slows down. Because for many, being silent is uncomfortable. It is at this moment that everything appears more clearly. The worries, the fears, the doubts. Everything comes to light. And that's why most prefer noise, distraction, constant movement. But what few understand is that this excess of noise is exactly what prevents the mind from being healed. God does not compete for space with noise. He doesn't force his voice in the midst of confusion. There is a spiritual pattern that repeats itself throughout Scripture. When all is still, he reveals himself. There was a time when a man, tired, overwhelmed, and emotionally drained, was seeking an answer from God. Strong winds passed, earthquakes happened, fire broke out, but God was not in any of these great signs. It was only after all this, when the environment became silent, that something different happened. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. That's the way God speaks to the mind, not with screams, not with pressure, but with a soft presence that can only be perceived when the inside calms down. And here's one of the most profound secrets about mind control. It's not just about resisting wrong thoughts, it's about creating space for the right voice to be heard. Maybe you're trying to find answers, seeking direction, asking for clarity. But his mind is so full that there is no room left for God to speak. There is too much information, too many worries, too many stimuli. And in the midst of all this, the voice that could bring peace ends up being muffled. Silence then ceases to be empty and becomes a place of encounter. When you learn to stop, to slow down, to step away for a few moments from everything that agitates the mind, something begins to change. At first it may seem strange, even uncomfortable. But little by little this silence begins to reveal things that were previously hidden. Thoughts begin to organize, emotions begin to align, and almost imperceptibly, a peace begins to emerge. It is not a forced peace, nor a fleeting one. It is something that comes from within, as if your mind is being adjusted by something bigger than you. And in that place, where there is no hurry, no noise, you begin to realize that God has never stopped speaking. You just couldn't hear it. If upon hearing this, something inside you desires that healing silence, write in the comments, "Lord, calm my mind." Sometimes a simple phrase of faith makes room for something profound to begin to happen within you. There is a silent pattern that imprisons many minds without them realizing it, always living in tomorrow. Anxiety does not arrive screaming. It settles little by little, occupying thoughts, creating scenarios, anticipating problems that do not even exist yet. And when you realize it, you are already tired, overwhelmed, trying to control what has not even happened yet. The anxious mind never rests, because it is always projected into the future, trying to predict, avoid, solve ahead of time. But there is something deeply spiritual about this that needs to be understood. Jesus revealed a principle that completely changes this logic. He didn't just teach about faith, he taught how the mind must function to live in peace. When he said, "Worry not about tomorrow," he was not ignoring the problems, but showing that anxiety is a distraction that takes you away from real trust in God. Because while your mind is stuck on what might happen, it disconnects from what God is doing right now. Do not worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will take care of itself. Enough of your evil every day. Matthew 6:34. This reveals something profound. God acts in the present, but anxiety pulls you to a place where he hasn't told you to be. And that is why the mind gets confused, agitated, weakened. It's not just worry, it's spiritual misalignment. It is like trying to live a time that has not yet come, while losing the grace that is available today. Maybe you've felt it. Thoughts that start small but grow, creating a weight in the chest, a restlessness that does not go away. You try to solve it, you try to think more, you try to find answers, but the more you think, the more you lose. Because anxiety is not resolved with more thought, it dissolves with confidence. And trust isn't about ignoring reality, it's about deciding that God is in control even when you don't understand everything. It is bringing the mind back over and over again to the now, for today, for this moment where you still breathe, you still have opportunity, you are still being sustained. To control the mind at this level is to learn to stop this cycle before it overwhelms you. When a thought about the future arises, you don't have to follow it. You can recognize, stop, and redirect. You can remember that God is already in tomorrow, even if you are not yet. And that changes everything, because it takes the weight off trying to control what was never in your hands. Gradually, the mind begins to slow down. The pressure decreases, and that constant sense of urgency begins to fade. In its place, something different, firmer, more stable emerges. A peace that does not depend on guarantees, but on trust. If you are here so far, it is because God is speaking to you in a very personal way. Perhaps this restlessness you feel is not the end, but the beginning of a profound transformation in your mind. And at the end of this path, there is a moment prepared especially for you, where we will connect with God more intensely. Stay until the end, because this meeting can mark a new beginning within you. There is something that many people have not yet realized. Controlling the mind is not a unique achievement, it is a daily practice. It's not something you learn once and never have to revise again. Rather, it is a continuous, silent and constant process. Because the mind is never neutral. Either it is being renewed or it is being influenced. Either you feed your mind with truth or it will be filled, little by little, with thoughts that do not come from God. Paul reveals this directly when he says, "And be renewed in the spirit of your mind." Ephesians 4:23. He does not speak of something punctual, but of continuous action. Renewing the mind is like taking care of something alive. If you stop taking care, it wears out. If you stop feeding, it weakens. And that's exactly how many end up falling back into old patterns, even after strong moments with God. It's not because they didn't have faith, it's because they didn't keep renewal. The human mind has a natural tendency to return to what is most familiar, even if it is unhealthy. Negative thoughts, insecurities, fears. All of this creates internal pathways that become automatic over time. And if there is no daily positioning, these paths come back to dominate. Therefore, controlling the mind requires constancy, not fleeting intensity, but silent discipline. Maybe you've experienced it, a moment in which he felt strong, at peace, with clarity. But days later, everything seemed confusing again. It doesn't mean you've lost something, it just means you need to keep going. Renewal doesn't happen all at once, it happens every day, in small decisions, in small choices, in thoughts that you accept or reject. And here's a point that changes everything. You need to feed your mind with what comes from God, because if you don't, the world will do it instead. And the world doesn't bring peace, it doesn't bring direction, it doesn't bring clarity. It fills the mind with noise, comparison, fear, and distraction. Therefore, renewal requires intention. It requires stopping, listening, reflecting, absorbing that which strengthens your faith. Over time, something begins to happen. Those thoughts that once dominated you begin to lose strength. What once shook you begins to no longer have the same impact. And without realizing it, your mind starts to work in another way, firmer, more stable, more aligned. It's not about never having bad thoughts again, it's about not allowing them to take root. It's about deciding every day who will rule your mind. Now, if that word made sense to you, state in the comments, Lord, renew my mind every day. Write this as a step of faith, as a quiet decision that begins today, and leave your like so that this message reaches other people who also need to live this transformation. There is a decisive moment that happens within the mind and that defines everything. The instant when a thought arises. Because, contrary to what many believe, the problem is not the thought appearing, it's what you do with it when it arrives. Destructive thoughts almost never enter aggressively. They arrive in a subtle way, as a suggestion, a slight doubt, a seemingly harmless idea, and that's exactly why they're so dangerous, because if you don't react at first, they take root. Jesus revealed this secret in a powerful way when he was led into the wilderness. He was confronted not with physical attacks, but with words, ideas, suggestions that tried to distort the truth. And at no time did he negotiate with those thoughts. He didn't reflect on them. He didn't give them space. He didn't try to understand better. He answered immediately, firmly, with authority. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone. Matthew 4:4. This shows something that completely changes the way we deal with the mind. Thoughts that do not come from God should not be analyzed. They should be confronted. Because the more you dialogue with what is negative, the more strength it gains within you. It's like feeding something that should be stopped. And many end up in prison exactly for that, because they pay too much attention to what should be rejected quickly. Maybe you've experienced this without realizing it. A thought of doubt that you let go, an insecurity that you began to consider, a concern that seemed small but that grew. And when he realized, it was already dominating his emotional state, affecting his decisions, stealing his peace. It all started with something simple, but it was not interrupted. Controlling the mind at this level requires vigilance and immediate response. It is not ignoring thought. It is taking a stand against it. It is to recognize that it does not come from God and therefore does not deserve space. And the faster you do it, the less force it has. Because thoughts only grow when they find acceptance. Over time, you begin to notice a different pattern within you. That which once dominated you begins to lose power. Those thoughts that once seemed like absolute truth begin to be questioned. And you start to live with more clarity, more firmness, more control. Not because you will never have bad thoughts again, but because you have learned not to allow them to remain. And this brings a freedom that many have never experienced. A lighter, more protected mind, more aligned with the truth. An internal space where peace is not easily interrupted because there is a constant positioning. If this message is already touching your heart, know that it was not by chance. God speaks to us in many ways, and if you have felt this word alive in your life, it is already a sign that He is acting. Now you have the opportunity to repay that blessing. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, this message reaches more lives that also need this touch of God. Let's spread this chain of faith and hope together. Leave your like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to be a part of this mission. There is a point at which the mind needs to choose what it is going to lean on, because it never remains neutral. When all is well, it's easy to hold positive thoughts, it's easy to believe, it's easy to have clarity. But when circumstances start to press, when what you see conflicts with what you expect, something inside you starts to be tested. And it is exactly at this moment that faith ceases to be just an idea and becomes a real force within the mind. Faith isn't just about believing that something can happen. It's about deciding who you're going to trust when nothing makes sense. Because the mind, by nature, seeks logic, seeks evidence, seeks guarantees, but faith works on another level. It sustains you when logic fails. She keeps her mind steady when everything around suggests otherwise. And this is not something theoretical. It is an internal positioning that completely changes the way you face life. There is a powerful example of this when someone received a promise that, humanly speaking, seemed impossible. Time passed, circumstances did not help, everything around pointed to the opposite. Still, the mind remained steady, not because he was ignorant of reality, but because he chose not to surrender to it. And he did not doubt the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith. Romans 4:20. This reveals a deep secret. Doubt may knock on the door of the mind, but it does not need to enter. Faith does not prevent contrary thoughts from appearing, but it does prevent them from becoming established. And when you understand that, something changes inside you. Because you stop fighting the existence of doubt and start strengthening your position in faith. Maybe today there are things in your life that don't make sense, situations that seem to be stuck, answers that do not arrive, paths that seem closed. And naturally the mind tries to fill those spaces with worry, with fear, with insecurity. But it is at this point that faith becomes essential, not to deny what you're seeing, but not to allow it to define what you believe. Faith organizes the mind. It brings stability where there was oscillation before. It prevents you from being carried away by any thought that arises. And little by little, you begin to realize that you no longer react in the same way. That which once shook you deeply now finds a firmer, more positioned, safer mind. And this security does not come from immediate answers. It comes from trust. Trust that God remains in control, even when you don't understand the process. Trust that there is something being built, even when you don't see it yet. This video came to you at the right time, bringing a word that can transform lives, starting with yours and that of someone who is in your heart right now. Perhaps, as you listened to this, a name came to your mind. Don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments. In doing so, you join a chain of faith that goes beyond this moment, presenting lives before God with confidence and hope. There is a type of pain that does not appear to others, but that completely changes the way you think. It's not just what happened, it's what stayed inside you afterwards. There are unanswered questions, feelings that mix, thoughts that become heavier every day. And many times in this process, the mind begins to get confused, to lose clarity, to try to understand something that doesn't seem to make sense. But there is a spiritual secret that few can see. When God is present, even pain has a purpose. The problem is that in the midst of suffering, the first thing the mind does is question. Why did this happen? Where was God? What did I do wrong? And these questions, when they are not conducted in the right way, begin to create an internal labyrinth. The person thinks too much, feels too much, gets lost within himself. But there is a turning point, a moment when pain ceases to be just suffering and begins to become revelation. There was someone who lived this intensely. He lost, suffered, questioned, faced a deep emotional breakdown. Everything around seemed to fall apart, and for a while, even his mind conflicted. But something began to happen in the middle of this process. The pain didn't destroy him. It began to reveal something bigger. In the end, he declared something that completely changes the way we see suffering. Before I knew you just by listening, but now my eyes see you. Job 42:5. This shows that there are levels of understanding that are only reached when the mind goes through certain processes. Not because God wants you to suffer, but because some internal structures are only transformed when everything that was superficial is removed. Pain, when led by God, does not confuse forever. It reorganizes. It breaks illusions, exposes truths, strengthens areas that were previously fragile. Maybe you're living in such a moment right now. Something you don't understand, something that has deeply moved you, something that has changed the way you see life. And in the midst of that, your mind tries to find answers, tries to balance, tries to move on. But maybe what's happening isn't the end, it's a process, an internal adjustment that has not yet ended. Because when God enters this place of pain, he not only consoles, he transforms. He takes what seemed to be just suffering and begins to use it as a tool for growth, maturation, spiritual clarity. And little by little, what was once confusing begins to make sense. Not because everything has been explained, but because his mind has been strengthened. Nothing happens by chance. If this message has come to you now, it may be because God is using just this moment to work within you in a way that you have not yet fully realized. Stay until the end, because there is still something deeper being prepared, something that can bring a peace that you may not even imagine you can feel. There is a deeper level of mind control that does not rely solely on human effort, discipline, or attempt. Because no matter how hard you try to organize your thoughts on your own, there will always be times when emotions speak louder, circumstances put pressure on you, and the mind seems to get out of control. And it is exactly at this point that many get frustrated, because they realize that they cannot maintain constancy with their own strength alone. But there is a spiritual secret that completely changes this dynamic. The mind only finds true balance when it stops being guided by itself and starts to be led by the Spirit of God. The human mind, when guided only by emotions or external situations, becomes unstable. One day it's firm, the next it's confused. One moment she is at peace, the next she is restless. This happens because he reacts to what he feels and what he sees. But when the mind begins to be guided by the Spirit, something different happens. She stops reacting and begins to discern. It is no longer taken and starts to be led. For the carnal mind is death, but the mind of the Spirit is life and peace. Romans 8:6. This word reveals that there are two ways of living within the mind. One is when everything is filtered by the emotions, the impulses, the pressures of the moment. This generates confusion, weariness, hasty decisions. The other is when the mind surrenders to the Spirit and then begins to operate at a higher level, where there is peace even without explanation, direction even without visible signs, steadfastness even in the midst of uncertainty. This transformation does not happen from the outside in. It starts on the inside. It is a process of surrender. It's not about trying to control everything, but about allowing God to take control. And this requires something that is not always easy. Giving up the need to understand everything, to have all the answers, to control every detail. When this surrender begins, the mind changes pace. That constant urgency begins to diminish. The need to solve everything immediately loses strength, and in its place comes a different, more stable, deeper sensation. As if, even without complete answers, there is a silent certainty that everything is being conducted. This does not mean that difficult thoughts disappear, but it does mean that they no longer dominate. Because now there is a greater direction within you, a presence that guides, adjusts, brings balance, and little by little you realize that you no longer react as before. It is not lost as easily. He does not let himself be carried away by any thought. Controlling the mind, at this level, ceases to be a constant struggle and becomes an ongoing relationship. A daily alignment with Spirit, where every thought is filtered, every decision is guided, and every emotion is put in the right place. And this is where a freedom begins that many have never experienced. Not the absence of thoughts, but the presence of direction. Not the forced silence, but the peace that remains even when everything around it has not yet been resolved. There is an image that you carry within yourself that often does not correspond to the truth about who you really are. And the most dangerous thing is that this image has been built over time, through experiences, words, frustrations, and fears. Without realizing it, the mind creates an identity based on what went wrong, what didn't work, what was said by other people. And little by little, you begin to believe in it as if it were definitive. Perhaps, at some level, you have already thought that you are not capable, that you are not strong enough, that you do not have what it takes to move forward, and these thoughts do not come out of nowhere. They are the result of a distorted inner vision. The problem is not only in what you face, but in the way you see yourself in the face of it. Because the way you see yourself determines how you act, how you react, and how far you believe you can go. There is a moment in the Bible that reveals just such a conflict. One man was hiding, afraid, trying to survive in the midst of hardship. Everything around reinforced the idea of weakness, limitation, incapacity, but suddenly something unexpected happens. God calls him in a completely different way from what he saw in himself. "The Lord is with thee, O mighty man of valor." Judges 6:12. That statement didn't make sense to his mind at the time. It was as if God was speaking of someone else. And that's exactly how it happens when God begins to reprogram the mind. He does not confirm the image you have built. He reveals the truth that you cannot yet see. Controlling the mind also involves this: learning to reject the identity based on fear and accept the identity based on God's truth. And this process is not automatic. At first there is resistance. The mind tries to go back to what is familiar, to what has been repeated so many times. But as you begin to accept what God says about you, something begins to change. Insecurity begins to lose ground. That feeling of inadequacy begins to weaken, and little by little you start acting differently, not because everything has changed around you, but because something has changed inside you. Your vision has been adjusted. God is not looking at you from your failures. He is looking at you from the purpose He has placed within you. And when you begin to align your mind with this truth, you stop living limited by what you felt and start living guided by what God has declared. Perhaps at this moment there is a big difference between how you see yourself and how God sees you. But that difference can begin to be adjusted now as you allow that truth to enter your mind and replace that which is not from Him. That word didn't come to you for nothing. God has amazing ways to reach our hearts, even in the details. If this has touched your soul, type "I trust God" in the comments. Let this be your act of faith today, even if it is in silence. There is something that can completely change the direction of your mind, but that almost no one notices on a daily basis: what you decide to focus on. Because your mind follows your focus. And if the focus changes, everything changes with it. The problem is that we live surrounded by distractions, worries, news, loose thoughts that pull attention everywhere. And when the mind is divided, it loses strength. It becomes unstable, vulnerable, easily influenced by any situation. Maybe you've felt it, a moment when I was well, with peace, with clarity. But all it took was a different thought, a concern, a piece of news, and everything changed. The mind left that place of stability and was seized by insecurity. This happens because the focus has been diverted. And when this happens, even what seemed firm begins to shake. There is a scene that reveals this very clearly. A man made a bold decision, left a safe place, and began to live something supernatural. While keeping his attention in the right direction, he did the impossible. But there was a moment when something changed. He sensed the wind, felt the intensity of the situation, and his attention left the place where it should be. But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid. Matthew 14:30. Nothing had changed around it. The scenario remained the same, but the change in focus completely altered the internal state. Fear entered, insecurity appeared, and what was once possible began to unravel. This shows that the problem is not only in the circumstances, but in what your mind chooses to observe. Controlling the mind requires discipline of focus. It's not just about avoiding bad thoughts, it's about constantly deciding where your attention will stay, because everything you feed with attention grows inside you. If you focus on the problem, it gains strength. If you focus on fear, it intensifies. But if you keep your mind directed to God, something different happens. God's presence has the ability to stabilize the mind, but that only happens when you stay connected. It's not something automatic, it's a continuous choice. It is to bring the mind back as many times as necessary. It's noticing when you've been distracted and, without guilt, redirecting again. And over time, this practice begins to transform you. What used to take you off track no longer has the same effect. That which once stole your peace now loses strength because your mind is no longer scattered. It is aligned, steady, sustained by something greater. If you've come this far, it's not by chance. There is something being adjusted within you, something that can completely transform the way you deal with your thoughts and everything around you. Don't leave now. Keep going, because what comes next can open your eyes to an even deeper level of control and peace that you may never have experienced before. There is something that can strengthen or weaken your mind without you realizing it. What you choose to remember. Memory is not just a record of the past, it directly influences what you feel in the present and how you see the future. And many end up trapped in cycles of doubt, fear, and discouragement, not because God isn't at work, but because they've forgotten what He's already done. The mind, when it is not directed, tends to pull negative memories, painful experiences, moments of failure. And when this happens frequently, a feeling is created that nothing goes right, that God is far away, that there is no way out. But this is not the complete reality. It is only a part of it that is constantly being revisited. There is a powerful spiritual principle that changes this completely. Intentionally remembering the works of God. Bring to mind what He has already done, the times you have been sustained, the situations in which it seemed impossible, but somehow everything has been resolved. This is not just an emotional exercise, it is a spiritual strategy. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I shall certainly remember your wonders of old. Psalms 77:11. This decision to remember changes the state of mind. Because when you begin to revisit God's faithfulness, something within you repositions itself. Doubt loses strength, fear decreases, hope begins to emerge again. Not because circumstances changed at that time, but because their perspective changed. The people of Israel lived this repeatedly. He witnessed miracles, provisions, deliverances. But over time I forgot. And when I forgot, my mind was filled with fear, complaint, insecurity. This shows that the problem was never God's lack of action, but the lack of spiritual memory. Perhaps you have also experienced things that today seem distant. Moments in which he felt the presence of God, answers that arrived, doors that opened. But over time, other concerns took up space, and those memories faded. And without realizing it, his mind began to lean more on what went wrong than on what God has already done right. Mind control also involves this, deciding what you are going to bring to mind. Because what you remember often becomes a reference for your thoughts. And when God's faithfulness becomes that benchmark, your mind gains stability. Gradually, you begin to face difficult situations in another way. Not with despair, but with a confidence that comes from what you have already experienced. It is as if your mind says, "He has done it before, He is still the same." If upon hearing this, you recognize that God has already acted in your life in some way, even if small, write in the comments, Amen. That simple word is a way of acknowledging, remembering, and declaring that you have not forgotten what God has already done. There is a critical moment when the mind needs to decide even before the situation happens. Because temptation does not begin in the act, it begins much earlier, within the thoughts. And when the mind is not ready, it tries to decide in the midst of pressure, in the midst of impulse, in the midst of emotion. And almost always in this state, the decision is not firm. That is why so many people fall, not because they are weak, but because they have not prepared themselves mentally before the moment comes. Controlling the mind at this level requires something deeper than willpower. It requires an early decision. It requires defining before any situation who you are, what you believe in, and how far you are willing to go. Because when this is already established within you, external pressure loses power. The situation may even be strong, but it does not find room to dominate. There is a striking example of someone who lived this clearly. He was in a difficult environment, far from home, far from everything he knew, and yet he kept his mind steady. When he was faced with a situation of temptation, he did not hesitate. He did not negotiate. He did not think twice. The answer was already ready within him. How then shall I do such wickedness and sin against God? Genesis 39:9. That answer was not born at that moment. It already existed inside his mind before the situation appeared, and that's exactly what makes all the difference. Because when the mind has already decided, the body just follows. But when the mind is indecisive, any pressure can alter the path. Maybe you've experienced moments when you thought later, I knew what I should have done, but at the time I couldn't. This happens because the decision was not consolidated within the mind, and when the moment came, there was room for doubt, for negotiation, for weakness. But there is a way to change that. It's starting to prepare your mind beforehand, define your limits, your values, your position, and not just superficially, but deeply, consciously. Because the clearer this is within you, the less room there is for error when the pressure comes. And this does not only apply to large situations, but also to small ones. Thoughts that seem harmless, seemingly simple choices, everyday decisions. All of this trains your mind, either strengthening or weakening. When you start living with that awareness, something changes. The mind becomes firmer, clearer, more decisive. And what once seemed difficult to resist is starting to lose strength. Not because it has ceased to exist, but because it no longer finds space within you. This word is not for everyone. If you are here, it is because there is something being worked on within your mind, something that can bring you to a level of mastery and clarity that you may never have experienced. Stay until the end, because what is yet to come may reveal something that will change the way you face every thought and every decision in your life. There are pains that do not appear in the body, but live in the mind every day. Wounds that do not bleed on the outside, but that remain open on the inside, influencing thoughts, emotions, and even decisions. Often the person goes on with life, tries to smile, tries to continue, but carries within himself a silent weight that no one sees. And the most delicate thing is that these invisible wounds begin to shape the way the mind works, creating insecurities, fears, and a sadness that seems to have no clear explanation. The wounded mind does not see reality clearly. She interprets everything through pain that has not yet been healed. Small situations take on greater weight, simple words seem harsher, and negative thoughts find easier ground to grow. And little by little, this creates a cycle where pain feeds thoughts, and thoughts reinforce pain. But there is a turning point that completely changes this scenario. It is not ignoring pain, nor trying to hide it, but taking it to God in a true way, without filters, without masks. There is a moment in the Bible that reveals just that. A woman carried within her a deep anguish, something that consumed her thoughts and completely affected her mind. She could no longer find peace. But instead of keeping it, she decided to pour it all out before God. It was not an ordinary prayer, it was a complete delivery. It was putting out what was trapped inside. And something started to happen at that moment. Even before any external response, even before any change in the situation, her mind was touched. And his countenance was no longer sad. 1 Samuel 1:18. This reveals a powerful secret. Healing begins within, before it appears outside. When the pain is truly delivered, something changes in the mind. The weight decreases, the internal pressure is relieved, and that cycle of thoughts begins to lose strength. Not because everything was resolved immediately, but because the pain was no longer carried on its own. Many people remain trapped because they try to deal with everything internally without opening this space with God. They guard, accumulate, try to be strong all the time. But the mind was not made to endure everything alone. She needs that place of surrender, that moment of sincere exposure before God, where there is no need to look good. When this happens, the mind begins to be restored from the inside out. Thoughts that were once heavy begin to soften. Emotions that were disordered begin to find balance. And little by little, that constant sadness is losing space. God does not ignore invisible wounds. He works exactly in them, in the place where no one sees, but where it all begins. And when that healing begins, the mind no longer responds in the same way. It no longer carries the same weight. It is no longer lost so easily because something inside has been treated. There is a type of prison that has no doors, no visible bars, but keeps the mind locked up every day. These are thoughts that repeat themselves, ideas that come back even when you try to ignore them, internal cycles that seem to have no end. And the hardest thing is that over time, this starts to look normal. The person gets used to constant worry, repetitive insecurity, that inner voice that always says the same negative things. But there is something that needs to be understood in depth. Repetitive thoughts create paths within the mind. The more you accept, the stronger they become. It is like a trail that is gradually opened until it becomes an automatic path. And when that happens, the mind begins to follow this pattern effortlessly, as if there were no other option. The problem is not only in the thought itself, but in the repetition without resistance. Because every time a negative thought comes back and finds space, it gets stronger. It creates an internal structure that begins to influence emotions, decisions, and even the way you see life. And without realizing it, you begin to live within this cycle. But this cycle can be broken. And it's not with more mental effort, nor trying to fight all thoughts at once. It is through positioning. It is to understand that you are not obliged to accept everything that crosses your mind. There is an authority that God has already released, but that needs to be exercised. Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set upon thee. Isaiah 26:3. This means that peace does not come from the absence of thoughts, but from the steadfastness of the mind. And firmness is not rigidity, it is direction. It's knowing where your mind should go every time you try to get lost. Because thoughts may arise, but they don't have to stay. The disciplined mind learns to identify patterns. You begin to realize when a thought is not from God, when it is just another repetition of something you have tried to master before. And at that moment, instead of going with the flow, it stops, redirects. Take a stand. In the beginning, this requires attention. It requires awareness, but over time, this new pattern begins to strengthen, and what was once automatic is starting to lose strength. The negative repetition decreases, and the mind begins to find new paths, healthier, more aligned, firmer. And then something changes in real form. The mind ceases to be a place of constant wear and tear and becomes a space of stability. Not perfect, but governed. Not silent all the time, but aligned. Can you imagine how many people are in need of a word like this right now? Just as you are being reached now, others are also living silent battles within the mind. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You help this message reach those who need it. And in a simple way, it becomes part of something bigger, bringing light where there is still confusion today. There is a profound difference between knowing something about God and having a real encounter with Him, because when it's just knowledge, the mind goes on operating the same way, just with more information. But when there is a true encounter, something inside you is interrupted, confronted and transformed in a way that can no longer go back to what it was before. The mind can spend years built on certainties, opinions, convictions that seem solid. You believe that you are right, that you understand, that you are on the right path, but sometimes all of this is based on a limited vision, on an incomplete understanding. And that is why, at certain times, God does not only teach, He intervenes. He breaks old patterns to establish a new way of thinking. There was someone who lived exactly that. His mind was firm, determined, full of convictions. He believed that he was doing what was right, that his direction was in line with God. But in the middle of the way, something happened. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't an explanation, it was a meeting. Something so strong that it interrupted everything, that made his mind stop, that exposed a truth that he had never considered. I am Jesus, whom you persecute. Acts 9:5. This sentence not only revealed a mistake, it broke an entire mental structure built over time. And at that moment, there was no resistance, there was no justification, there was silence, there was an impact, there was a transformation. This shows that there are levels of change that don't just happen with effort or gradual learning. There are times when God touches the mind directly and redefines everything. Thoughts that once seemed right no longer make sense. Paths that once seemed clear lose direction, and a new consciousness begins to emerge. This type of encounter is not only emotional, it is structural. It reorganizes the way you think, how you see, how you decide. It is not a superficial improvement, it is a profound transformation. And from that point on, the mind never goes back to the same state because there is now a truth that has been revealed in a direct way. Perhaps you have never experienced something like this so intensely, but there are times when God begins this process in a more subtle way. A word that touches deeper, a perception that changes, an understanding that arrives unexpectedly. Small meetings that little by little adjust your mind. And when that starts, you realize that you no longer think like you used to. He no longer reacts in the same way. He is no longer tied to the same things, because something within you has been achieved in a real way. Controlling the mind at this level is not just discipline, it is allowing God to come in and transform what you alone could never completely change. It is to make room for Him to reveal what needs to be adjusted and lead you to a new way of living, where your thoughts begin to reflect a higher, clearer truth, more aligned with the purpose He has established. There is something that profoundly challenges the human mind: waiting, because the mind wants quick answers, immediate solutions, clear signs that everything is moving. But when God works, He often chooses a different path. A path where time seems slower, where the answers don't arrive at the speed you'd like, where everything seems to be on pause. And it is exactly in this space that the mind begins to be tested. Waiting reveals what is inside you. It exposes anxiety, insecurity, the tendency to want to solve everything alone. Because when nothing happens externally, the mind starts creating internal movements. He begins to question, to doubt, to imagine scenarios. And if there is no position, this waiting turns into restlessness. But there is another side to waiting that few understand. It is not just empty time, it is an active process of construction. While you think nothing is happening, God is working in areas you don't see, adjusting your mind, strengthening your faith, preparing you for what is yet to happen. And so, waiting patiently, he obtained the promise. Hebrews 6:15. This shows that the promise was not only received, it was sustained over time. Because receiving something from God is one part, but standing firm until it is fulfilled is quite another. And it is in this interval that the mind must learn to trust. Perhaps the most difficult thing is not dealing with the problem, but dealing with time. The feeling that it could have already happened, that it could be more advanced, that something is taking too long. And at that moment, the mind tries to speed up processes, create alternatives, look for shortcuts. But not everything that is fast comes from God, and not everything that takes time is out of his control. Controlling the mind also involves this: resisting haste. Understand that there is a right time, an exact moment, an alignment that you can't see completely, and that trying to anticipate can generate more confusion than solution. When you learn to wait the right way, something changes inside you. Anxiety begins to lose strength, the need for control decreases, and a deeper trust begins to emerge, not based on what you see, but on who God is. Waiting is no longer a burden, and begins to become a space for maturation. A place where your mind is strengthened, where your faith deepens, where you learn to stand firm even without immediate answers. And, little by little, you realize that you are not standing still. It is being prepared. If this video is giving you answers you needed to hear, don't let that confirmation pass you by. Write in the comments, "God cares for me," and state that truth about your life, even in the time of waiting. There is a place where the mind finally stops oscillating, running, trying to balance itself. It's not when problems disappear, nor when everything is solved on the outside. This is when God's presence becomes constant within you. Because while many people try to control their mind with techniques, strategies, or self-effort, there is a deeper level where stability comes not from control, but from connection. The human mind, by itself, is unstable. He reacts to what he sees, to what he feels, to what happens around him. One day she is calm, the next she is restless. One moment it is confident, the next it is full of doubts. And this is not because of weakness, but because it is being guided by circumstances. But when God's presence comes to occupy this space, something begins to change, silently and steadily. There was someone who lived surrounded by pressure, responsibility, conflicts, and difficult decisions. And even so, it maintained a stability that made no sense to those looking from the outside. This did not come from the absence of problems, but from an ongoing relationship with God. It wasn't something occasional, it was constant. And in a remarkable moment, God declared something that reveals the secret of this stability. "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Exodus 33:14. This rest is not only physical, it is mental. It is a peace that does not depend on everything being resolved, but on knowing that God is present in every detail. And when the mind begins to live in this place, it stops reacting to everything and starts to remain steadfast, even when the scenario does not change. Perhaps you have tried to find this peace in various ways. He tried to distract himself, tried to ignore thoughts, tried to convince himself that everything was fine. But none of this sustains for long, because the mind needs something deeper. It needs a base, a presence, a relationship that does not depend on circumstances. When you begin to cultivate that presence continuously, something changes within you, not suddenly, but progressively. The mind begins to slow down, the restlessness subsides, the need to understand everything loses strength, and little by little, you realize that there is a stability that does not come from outside, but from within. This doesn't mean that everything becomes perfect, but it does mean that you are no longer overwhelmed by what happens. There is a steadfastness that remains, a peace that sustains, a direction that guides. And all of this is born from a real, constant, living relationship. Because in the end, controlling the mind is not just a matter of discipline, it's a matter of presence. It is allowing God to occupy that space every day, in every thought, in every decision, in every moment. What you'll hear next may be just what your mind needs to take an even deeper step on this journey. Many people don't realize when that moment comes, but it can change everything. Stay until the end, because something even stronger is being prepared for you. There is a kind of mental confusion that comes not from a lack of ability, nor from the absence of answers, but from something deeper, misalignment with God's purpose. Because the mind may try to organize paths, create plans, seek solutions, but when it is resisting what God has already defined, it never finds complete rest. There will always be an uneasiness, a feeling that something is not fitting, even when everything seems to be under control. Often the person does not realize this immediately. She continues to try to adjust her life on her own, making decisions based on what she thinks is best, what seems safest or most comfortable, but deep down there is a constant tension. As if he were walking, but without clear direction, as if he were doing a lot, but without peace. This is because the mind was created to function in alignment with God's purpose. When this alignment is broken, confusion arises. Not necessarily external chaos, but an internal misalignment that affects thoughts, emotions, and decisions. There was someone who lived through exactly this conflict. He received a clear direction, but decided to follow another path. He tried to run away. He tried to ignore it. He tried to build his own route. But the further he advanced, the more his mind became restless. Nothing seemed to go completely right, and the internal weight only increased. It wasn't just a matter of circumstance, it was a conflict between what he wanted and what God had already determined. And this reveals something profound. It is no use for the mind to insist on a path that is not aligned with the purpose. There may even be movement, but there will be no peace. There may be apparent progress, but there will be no true clarity. Many are the plans in the heart of man, but the one that prevails is the purpose of the Lord. Proverbs 19:21. This truth does not come to limit, but to liberate. Because when the mind stops resisting and begins to cooperate with God's plan, something changes immediately. The confusion begins to subside. Restlessness loses strength. And a clarity begins to emerge, not because everything has been explained, but because you are finally in the right place. Mind control also involves this, recognizing when you are trying to handle everything on your own and deciding to align yourself with what God has already established, not as an obligation, but as an understanding that this is the only place where there is true peace. And when that surrender happens, the mind finds rest. Not a rest based on complete answers, but on direction. Not an empty silence, but a stability that comes from knowing that you are no longer fighting against what God wants, but walking together with Him. From that point on, thoughts begin to organize themselves differently. Decisions gain more clarity, and that constant feeling of being lost begins to fade, giving way to a firm peace, which remains even when the path is still being revealed. There is a level of mind protection that goes beyond simply avoiding what is clearly wrong. Because not everything that leads you away from God seems bad at first glance. Often, the greatest danger is precisely in what seems right, seems good, seems logical, but it does not come from God. And this is where something essential for those who want to control the mind in a spiritual way comes in: discernment. The mind without discernment becomes vulnerable. She is guided only by what she feels, by what she sees, by what makes sense at the moment. And this can lead to decisions that seem correct at first, but which over time reveal consequences that could have been avoided. Because not every opportunity is direction, not every open door is purpose, not every feeling of momentary peace is divine confirmation. To discern is to see beyond appearance. It is to understand what is behind a thought, a choice, a proposal. It's having the ability to stop and ask, does this really come from God, or does it just look good in my eyes? And this skill is not born naturally, it needs to be developed. There was someone who understood this in a profound way. Faced with the opportunity to ask for anything, he didn't ask for wealth, he didn't ask for power, he didn't ask for success. He asked for something that few value, but that changes everything, wisdom to discern. Give therefore to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people. 1 Kings 3:9. This choice reveals that a protected mind is not one that never faces difficult decisions, but one that knows how to distinguish the right path in the midst of so many options. Because the biggest mistake is not to choose blatant evil, but to choose something that looks good, but is not in line with God's will. How often the mind is confused by exactly this. She is torn between paths, analyzes possibilities, tries to predict results, but there is still no peace, and this lack of peace is often a sign that something isn't aligned, even if it feels right. When discernment begins to develop, the mind changes its posture. She does not rush into it. She does not let herself be carried away by impulse. She is not enchanted only by appearance. She observes more, listens more, expects more, and little by little he begins to notice details that previously went unnoticed. This brings a different security, not a security based on control, but on clarity. The mind stops walking in the dark, making random decisions, and starts walking with awareness, with direction, with spiritual understanding. And this type of protection avoids many paths that could generate pain, confusion, and regret. Because even before entering, the mind already discerns. If as you listen to this, there is some area of your life where you need direction, don't keep it to yourself. Put it before God. Write in the comments your prayer request, what is in your heart, what needs clarity. When you express this in faith, you're not just writing, you're positioning yourself spiritually to receive direction. There is a kind of mental strength that only reveals itself when everything around you pressures you to give in. It is not the force that appears when all is well, but the one that stands firm when there is risk, when there is opposition, when there are real consequences. And the most impressive thing is that this strength is not born at the moment of crisis. It has been built before, in silence, in constancy, in daily decisions that no one has seen. Many people believe that they will be able to stand firm when the pressure comes, but they have never prepared their minds for it. They live in an unstable way, without spiritual consistency, without depth, and expect to have firmness in decisive moments. But the mind does not suddenly become strong. It responds according to what it has been trained over time. There was someone who faced an extreme situation, an order was established, a clear threat was declared, and anyone in that position would think twice before acting. The risk was real, the consequences were serious, and everything indicated that the most sensible thing would be to retreat, to adapt, to avoid confrontation. But there was a different decision. Daniel, 3 times a day he knelt down and prayed. Daniel 6:10. This was not an impulsive reaction. It was the continuation of an already established habit. He didn't start seeking God at that moment. He had already lived it before. And that's exactly why his mind wasn't shaken. Because when the crisis arrived, he didn't have to decide who it would be. That was already defined within him. This is the point that many do not realize. Mental stability is not built in pressure, it reveals itself in it. It is in everyday life, in ordinary moments, in small choices, that the mind is strengthened. That's where you decide to maintain your connection with God, even when there's no urgency, even when there's no apparent need. And when this becomes constant, something changes within you. The mind becomes firmer, more stable, less influenced by the environment. And when difficult situations arise, you don't get lost. You don't negotiate your principles. You don't adapt out of fear. Maybe today you are not yet in an extreme situation, but that doesn't mean you don't need to prepare. Because the way you live now is shaping how you're going to react later. Every moment of discipline, every choice to stand firm, every decision to maintain your connection with God is building a mind that won't be easily shaken. And when this level of firmness is reached, peace ceases to depend on circumstances. Because even if everything around you tries to press on, there is something inside you that is already established. A conviction that doesn't change, a faith that doesn't negotiate, a mind that stays aligned no matter what happens. There is something that invades the mind silently, but extremely powerfully. Fear. He doesn't need permission. He doesn't let him know when he arrives. He just shows up and starts taking up space. And when the mind is not prepared, it grows fast. It distorts reality, magnifies problems, weakens decisions, and makes everything seem bigger than it really is. The most dangerous thing is that fear doesn't have to be real to seem true. It just needs the mind to accept the image it creates. But there is a clear difference between feeling fear and being dominated by it. Because fear may arise, but it doesn't have to remain. And it is precisely at this point that trust in God becomes a decisive force within the mind. It's not the absence of fear, it's the conscious choice not to allow it to rule your thoughts. When fear comes to me, I will trust in you. Psalms 56:3. This statement reveals a powerful secret. Fear comes, but the answer can also come. There is a decision that can be made at the very moment when the thought of fear tries to set in. And this decision completely changes the course of the mind. There was a moment when everyone around was overcome with fear. The situation was clear, the challenge was great, the threat seemed impossible to overcome. Looks were focused on the problem, words reinforced the size of the difficulty, and the collective mind had already accepted defeat before even trying. But there was someone who thought differently. While everyone looked at the size of the threat, he chose to look at what God had already done. While fear said it was not possible, trust said that God was still the same. And this difference in focus changed everything, because the mind that trusts does not ignore danger, but neither does it bow to it. What often holds the mind is not the problem itself, but the way it is interpreted. When fear dominates, everything seems bigger, more difficult, more distant. But when confidence comes in, something starts to adjust. Vision changes, breathing calms, thoughts reorganize. Mind control also involves this, intentionally choosing who you will trust when fear strikes, because he will appear. In unexpected moments, in challenging situations, in thoughts that arise without warning. But the difference is in the answer. When you learn to respond with confidence, fear loses ground. It does not disappear completely, but it no longer has control. And little by little, the mind becomes firmer, more stable, more secure. You begin to realize that what used to paralyze you no longer has the same effect. That which once took away your peace now finds a more prepared mind. And this transformation does not come from the outside, it comes from within, from a repeated decision, strengthened each time you choose to trust. You were reached because you were chosen. This message has a purpose in your life, and God knows exactly what He is doing. If you felt it deep in your soul, type in the comments, "God chose me." and live this truth every day. There is a truth that is difficult to accept, but it defines the level of freedom of your mind. What you cling to has power over you. No matter how hard you try to control your thoughts, if there is something taking the place that should be God's, your mind will never be completely at peace. Because attachment creates worry, it creates fear of losing, it creates anxiety to maintain, and all of this begins to dominate the interior silently. Often this attachment doesn't feel wrong. It can be something good, something achieved, something you value. But when it starts to take up too much space within you, when your thoughts constantly revolve around it, when your peace depends on it, then it's no longer just something you have. It's something that holds you back. There was a moment when someone approached Jesus with a sincere question. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to understand the path. He wanted to live something deeper. But there was something inside him that wasn't lined up yet. And Jesus, looking beyond the words, revealed exactly where the problem was. Go, sell everything you have, and follow me. Matthew 19:21. This was not just an external instruction, it was an internal revelation. Because what bound that man was not what he had, but the place that it occupied within him. His mind was connected to it so strongly that there was no room for a complete surrender. And this is exactly what prevents many people from living a free mind. It is not a lack of faith, it is not a lack of desire, it is a lack of renunciation. Because controlling the mind is not only learning to deal with thoughts, it is also removing what feeds the inner restlessness. Perhaps, if you look at it sincerely, you will realize that there are areas in your life that take up too much space. Things you think about all the time, constant worries, attachments that generate fear of losing. And all this creates an instability that does not allow the mind to rest. Renunciation is not loss. It is liberation. It's not about letting go out of obligation, but about understanding that nothing can take God's place within you. Because when that happens, the mind is divided, and a divided mind never finds complete peace. When you begin to let go of that which competes with God, something changes in a profound way. The pressure decreases, the fear loses strength, the anxiety begins to disappear. And little by little, the mind finds a new, lighter, freer space. Not because you have nothing else, but because nothing else has you. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, trying to understand why your mind doesn't find complete rest. And maybe that's the key you needed to realize. Stay until the end, because there is still something deeper that can completely transform the way you live inside. There is a direct connection that many ignore, but which defines the state of mind, the relationship between obedience and peace. Because the mind is not disorganized by random thoughts or external circumstances alone, it often becomes restless when it knows, deep down, that something is not in line with what God has already shown. It's a quiet tension, hard to explain, but impossible to ignore completely. Disobedience rarely starts out as something big. It starts in details, in small decisions, in adjustments that seem harmless. The mind tries to justify, tries to adapt, tries to find reasons to continue on that path. But even when everything seems to be under control, there is an inner discomfort that remains, a restlessness that does not go away, because the mind was created to function in alignment with the truth. There was someone who lived this progressively. At first, small choices outside of God's direction seemed to be of no great consequence. But over time, these decisions began to affect his mind. Clarity was replaced by confusion, security gave way to insecurity, and that stability that once existed began to disappear. It wasn't all at once, it was gradually, until his mind could no longer find rest. Behold, obeying is better than sacrificing. 1 Samuel 15:22. This word reveals that there is no point in trying to compensate for disobedience with other attitudes. It's no use doing more, trying to balance, trying to justify, Peace of mind does not come from external attempts. It comes from internal alignment with what God has already established. Controlling the mind also involves courage. Courage to recognize when something needs to be adjusted. Courage to get off paths that seem easier but that are not aligned. Because often, what seems simpler at the moment generates more confusion later. When obedience comes in, something changes immediately, not necessarily in circumstances, but within the mind. That internal weight starts to come off. Clarity returns. Peace begins to establish itself more firmly. Because now there is no more internal division. There is no more conflict between what you know and what you do. The mind finds rest when it is aligned, and this alignment does not come from perfection, but from willingness. Willingness to listen, to adjust, to walk according to what God is directing. Perhaps at this point there is something that you already know that needs to change, something that God has already shown, but that you are still postponing. And this restlessness you feel may not be an unsolvable problem. It may be a sign that there is an adjustment waiting to happen. If this message reached you, it was not by chance. God wants to speak to your heart in a direct and personal way. And if you want to keep getting words like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this journey still has a lot to reveal. There is a silent force that can completely change the course of your mind, even when everything around you seems to fall apart. Hope, not as a passing feeling, but as a conscious decision not to allow circumstances to define what you think. Because when the mind is based only on what it sees, it becomes vulnerable. But when she learns to see beyond, she finds a stability that does not depend on the scenario. There are times when everything seems out of place. Difficult situations pile up, answers don't arrive, and the mind begins to fill with heavy thoughts. It is as if everything points to the worst, as if there were no visible way out. And in this state, the natural tendency is to give in to discouragement, to allow the mind to go with the flow of what is happening. But there is a choice that can interrupt this cycle. Not a choice based on emotion, but on positioning. There was someone who lived in the midst of chaos, surrounded by destruction, pain, and uncertainty. Everything around was negative, everything indicated loss, everything seemed unsolvable, and yet in the midst of this scenario, he made a decision that completely changed the state of his mind. I want to bring to mind what can give me hope. Lamentations 3:21-23. This phrase reveals a powerful principle. He did not ignore reality, but chose what he would feed inside his mind. Because the mind will always follow what you decide to remember, what you decide to focus on, what you decide to reinforce. The hope at this level is not to expect everything to improve automatically. It's deciding that regardless of what's going on, you're not going to allow your mind to be overwhelmed by despair. It is to bring to mind that which strengthens, that which lifts, that which reminds us of who God is, even when everything seems otherwise. Controlling the mind also involves this daily choice. Because negative thoughts will arise, difficult circumstances will happen, but you can decide what remains. You can choose not to feed what weakens you. You may decide to reposition your mind even when you don't feel like it. And little by little, this practice begins to transform everything. The mind stops reacting automatically to chaos and starts responding firmly. Discouragement loses strength. The clarity begins to return, and that feeling of being lost begins to give way to a deeper trust. Because hope doesn't just change what you feel, it changes how you think. And when the way of thinking changes, the way of living also begins to change. There is a silent danger that weakens the mind without making a sound. Isolation. When the mind closes, When the person distances himself, when he begins to face everything alone, something begins to disorganize inside. Thoughts become more intense, doubts increase, and what could be resolved clearly starts to grow without limit. Because the isolated mind loses reference, loses balance, loses strength. Often this happens without realizing it. The person begins to move away, to keep everything to themselves, to avoid sharing what they feel. And at first, it seems easier, it seems safer. But over time, this isolation turns into an environment where negative thoughts find free space to grow. Without confrontation, without direction, without support, they repeat themselves, strengthen themselves, and begin to dominate. But there is one spiritual principle that protects the mind in a powerful way: communion. Not just being close to people, but being connected with those who share the same faith, the same pursuit, the same purpose. Because when there is this connection, the mind is not alone with its own thoughts. And enduring with one accord always. Acts 2:46. This unit was not only external, it was internal. There was an alignment, a connection that strengthened not only the faith, but also the mind. Because when you are in communion, what you cannot see alone, another can help you to see. What seems too big in your mind loses strength when it is shared. Mind control also involves recognizing that you are not meant to walk alone. There is a force that manifests itself when there is union, when there is exchange, when there is spiritual support. Because isolated thoughts tend to distort, but when they are brought to light, they begin to lose power. Perhaps you have experienced moments when you talk to someone, when you hear a word, when you share what was inside you, something has changed. That weight decreased, that confusion was organized, that anguish lost strength. This is not a coincidence, it is a spiritual principle. The connected mind is strengthened. He gains new perspectives, receives encouragement, finds direction. And this creates a buffer against destructive thoughts that when isolated seem bigger than they really are. And little by little, you realize that you don't have to carry everything yourself. That there are people, there is a body, there is a fellowship prepared by God to strengthen you. And when you allow yourself to live that, your mind starts to find more stability, more clarity, more balance. Because the strength of the mind is not only in what you control alone, but also in the connections you allow to build. Few people will understand this message, but if you are here, it is because God wants to speak directly to you. Open your heart and continue, because what is yet to come may reveal something that will completely change the way you see your journey. There is a level of transformation of the mind that happens when you stop looking only at yourself and start carrying others in prayer. Because while the mind is focused only on its own problems, it tends to spin in circles, amplifying worries, reinforcing pain, and creating a constant weight. But when you enter into intercession, something changes deep within you. Interceding is not just asking for someone, it is taking a spiritual stand in favor of another life. It's stepping out of center and allowing your heart to align with God's heart. And in that process, the mind begins to be transformed in a way that goes beyond external circumstances. There was a time when a situation could have ended in destruction. The mistake had already happened, the consequences were inevitable, and everything indicated that the end would be marked by judgment. But at that moment, someone stood up not to accuse, not to walk away, but to intercede. But Moses besought the Lord. Exodus 32:11. This attitude reveals something powerful. While many would look only at the error, he chose to look with compassion. While others would walk away, he approached in prayer. And in this movement, not only did the situation begin to change, but his mind was also shaped. Because intercession changes the way you think. It takes the focus off the ego, self-defense, constant self-concern, and directs your mind to something bigger. You begin to see with more mercy, with more understanding, with more spiritual sensitivity. Controlling the mind also involves this: learning to get out of yourself. Because many of the restlessness that dominates the mind is fueled by an excessive focus on the problem itself. And when that focus is broken, when you start praying for others, something inside you rearranges itself. The internal pressure decreases, anxiety loses space, and instead a different, lighter, more aligned feeling arises. Not because your problems have disappeared, but because your mind is no longer stuck to just them. Intercession also creates a level of connection with God that goes beyond personal requests. It's a deeper relationship where you participate in what God is doing in other people's lives, and it expands your vision, strengthens your faith, and adjusts your thoughts. Over time, you realize that your mind no longer reacts in the same way. There is more balance, more clarity, more peace. Because now it is no longer centered only on itself, but connected with something bigger. And in that place, the mind finds a new kind of stability, one that is born of compassion, surrender, and direct connection to the heart of God. There is a state of mind that many know well, but few can explain: inner confusion. It's not just a lack of response, it's an excess of thoughts. It's not the absence of direction, it's overload. The mind begins to divide itself between so many concerns, so many tasks, so many voices, that everything gets mixed up. And in this state, even what is simple seems difficult, even what is clear seems distant. Confusion does not arrive all at once. It builds little by little. Small worries pile up, responsibilities increase, thoughts multiply. And when you realize it, your mind is already restless, accelerated, unable to stop. The problem is not just what's going on around you, but what's taking up space inside you. There is a scene that reveals exactly this kind of mind. A person was surrounded by tasks, trying to handle everything, preoccupied with details, busy with many things at the same time, and apparently everything she did was important. But in the midst of this unrest, something essential was being left aside. You are restless and worry about many things. Luke 10:41-42. This phrase does not only point to the excess of activities, but to the state of the mind. Restlessness, worry, distraction. And this shows that it is not the amount of things you do that disorganizes your mind, but what occupies the center of it, because it is possible to be busy and still at peace, just as it is possible to be doing important things and still be lost inside. The difference is in the priority. When God's presence ceases to be the center, the mind begins to disperse. Everything seems urgent, everything seems necessary, and the essential is lost in the middle of it. Mind control also involves simplifying. It is recognizing that not everything deserves your attention in the same way. It is learning to stop, to reorganize, to bring your mind back to what really sustains you, because when God's presence comes back to the center, something starts to line up. The restlessness subsides, the confusion begins to dissipate, thoughts are organized, and that feeling of being overwhelmed begins to lose strength, not because all responsibilities have disappeared, but because your mind has found the right place again. Clarity doesn't come from doing more, it comes from focusing better. It doesn't come from solving everything, it comes from prioritizing what really matters. And when this happens, the mind ceases to be a place of conflict and becomes a space of direction. If this video is giving you answers you needed to hear, don't let that confirmation pass you by. Write in the comments, "I trust God's action," and state that truth about your life as your mind begins to find clarity again. There is a decisive moment in the spiritual life that does not happen on the outside, but inside the mind. It's not when everything is clear, nor when all the answers have already arrived, but when a silent question echoes within you. Are you willing? Because God's call does not begin with a task. It begins with an inner response. And this answer is born in the mind, in the place where profound decisions are formed. Often the person feels that there is something more, a direction, a purpose, but at the same time thoughts of incapacity, insecurity, doubt arise. The mind begins to question if it is ready, if it has what is necessary, if it will get it. And in this conflict many end up resisting, not because they don't want to, but because they can't see beyond their own limitations. But there is a moment when something changes, not because all doubts have disappeared, but because the mind decides to align with something greater than the fears themselves. There was someone who lived exactly that. Before God's presence, his first reaction was not trust, it was recognition of his own limitation. He saw who he was, he saw his flaws, he saw his inability. But in that same meeting, something was adjusted within him. After this, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who shall go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." Isaiah 6:8. That answer didn't come from someone perfect. It came from someone who allowed God to transform their perception. Because the call does not depend on your natural ability, but on your willingness to surrender. And that surrender starts in the mind when you decide to stop resisting and start trusting. Controlling the mind also involves this, not allowing thoughts of limitation to prevent you from responding to what God is directing. Because many times, the biggest block is not in the circumstances, but in the way you see yourself. The mind creates barriers that seem real, but which have no power when confronted with God's truth. When this change happens, something is released within you. Doubt loses strength, insecurity decreases, and a different courage arises, not based on absolute certainty, but on trust. You begin to understand that you don't need to have everything sorted out to take a step. You just need to be available. And this availability changes everything. Because the mind ceases to be a place of resistance and becomes a place of response. Instead of constantly questioning, she takes a stand. Instead of retreating, it moves forward. And little by little, you realize that what seemed impossible begins to become a path. The mind that responds to the call is not the one that does not feel fear, but the one that decides not to be guided by it. She is the one who understands that God does not seek perfection, he seeks surrender. And when this surrender happens, the impossible is no longer a limit and becomes the beginning of something you would never live alone. There is something that many do not realize, but that directly influences the way you see God, the state of your mind. Because it's not just about believing, it's not just about seeking, it's about how your thoughts are organized inside. A charged, divided mind, full of mixed intentions, can hardly perceive God's presence clearly, not because he is distant, but because something inside is preventing this perception. Purity of mind goes beyond what is visible. It is not just about external attitudes, but about hidden thoughts, silent motivations, intentions that no one sees. It's what happens inside you when no one is looking. And it is exactly in this place that the connection with God begins to be defined. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:8. This statement reveals something profound. Seeing God is not just an external experience, it is a spiritual perception, and this perception is directly linked to inner purity. When the mind is clear, aligned, sincere, it begins to see what previously went unnoticed. Small signs, subtle directions, a peace that cannot be explained. All of this becomes clearer, But when the mind is contaminated, full of distractions, divided intentions, or misaligned thoughts, that perception is lost. The person even seeks, even prays, even tries, but finds it difficult to feel, to understand, to perceive. And this does not happen for lack of effort, but for lack of internal alignment. Mind control also involves this process of purification, not in the sense of immediate perfection, but of consciousness. It is to begin to observe what you have allowed to remain within you, what thoughts you feed, what intentions you carry, what motivations are guiding your decisions, because little by little these things will shape your perception. And without realizing it, you begin to move away from spiritual sensitivity, not because God has moved away, but because the mind has lost the ability to perceive. When this purification begins, something changes in a profound way. The mind becomes lighter, clearer, more sensitive. That inner confusion diminishes, that difficulty in understanding God's direction begins to disappear, and a clearer, more direct, more vivid perception emerges. You begin to perceive God in the details, in the little things, in the simple moments, and it completely transforms the way you live. Because it's no longer just a distant quest, it's a constant presence. The pure mind is not the one that never fails, but the one that adjusts, that cleanses, that aligns itself continuously. And in that process, something opens up inside you. A new way of seeing, feeling, understanding. And when that happens, you realize that God has never been far away. He was always there, waiting only for his mind to be clear enough to recognize him. There is a prison that has no visible bars, but keeps the mind trapped for years: the lack of forgiveness. And the hardest thing is that many times the person doesn't even realize that they are still carrying it. The pain has already happened, time has passed, life has gone on, but inside something is still linked to that situation. Thoughts come back. Feelings repeat themselves, memories still cause weight, and without realizing it, the mind remains stuck in something that should have already been released. Forgiveness is not about the other, it is about what happens inside you. Because while there is hurt, there is an emotional bond that keeps the mind connected to the pain, and this consumes energy, steals peace, creates cycles of thoughts that seem to have no end. The person tries to move on, but something always pulls back. Maybe you've felt it. That memory that comes back without warning, that feeling that reappears, that desire to understand why it happened. And the more you think about it, the more it seems to go deeper, because the mind, when it does not release, keeps revisiting. But there is a way to break this cycle. It's not easy, it's not automatic, but it's liberating. It is the decision to forgive. Not because the other deserves it, but because you need to be free. Because while forgiveness does not happen, the mind continues to carry something that should have already been delivered. There was an extreme moment when someone was wronged, hurt, attacked. Humanly, any reaction would be understandable, but at that moment, a completely different decision was made. Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Acts 7:60. This choice reveals a level of freedom that does not depend on circumstances. Because forgiveness doesn't change what happened, but it changes what it keeps doing inside you. It breaks the cycle, stops the repetition, frees the mind from carrying a weight that was not meant to remain. Controlling the mind also involves this: recognizing that holding pain does not protect you, it imprisons you. And that to liberate is not to lose, it is to recover your peace. It is allowing your mind to stop revolving around the past and start living more lightly in the present. When forgiveness happens, something changes in a profound way. The mind begins to breathe again. Those thoughts that used to come back with force begin to lose intensity. And little by little, you realize that you are no longer attached to it. Not because he forgot, but because he was free. And this freedom makes room for something new, for lighter thoughts, for more balanced emotions, for a life that is no longer tied to what was left behind. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can confirm within you that this transformation is not only possible, but is already starting to happen. Stay tuned, because this might be exactly what you needed to understand today. There is a point where you need to stop fighting your thoughts as if you were a victim of them, and start positioning yourself as someone who has been given authority over their own mind. Because many live as if they were at the mercy of what they think, as if every thought has absolute power, as if there is nothing to be done but to endure. But this is not true spiritually. The mind was not created to dominate you, it was created to be governed. And when you don't take that position, you automatically give that space to any thought that comes up. Doubts come in, fears set in, lies begin to repeat themselves, and little by little, everything seems out of control. Not because you don't have strength, but because you haven't yet assumed the authority that has already been released. Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions. Luke 10:19. This word does not speak of passivity, it speaks of positioning. There is a spiritual authority that has been given, but it needs to be exercised, and that starts in the mind, because that's where it all begins. Before any attitude, before any decision, there is a thought, and that's where you need to take action. Mind control is not about waiting for negative thoughts to go away on their own. It is to recognize when they arise and decide that they will not have space. It is to take a stand against that which is not in line with God's truth, not with fear, not with doubt, but with authority. Perhaps you are used to just observing your thoughts, letting them come and go without interference. But there is a deeper level where you don't just observe, you rule. Where you don't just feel, you decide. Where you don't just react, you position yourself. This completely changes the dynamics of the mind, because now, when a thought of fear arises, it meets resistance. When a doubt arises, it is confronted. When a lie tries to establish itself, it is rejected. And little by little, the mind begins to understand that it is not just anything that can remain there. At first, this requires awareness. It requires constant attention. But over time, this authority begins to become natural. The mind is strengthened, organized, aligned, and what once seemed uncontrollable is starting to lose strength. You stop being led and start leading. It ceases to be dominated and starts to rule. And it doesn't come from you alone. It comes from the authority that God has already placed within you. An authority that does not depend on what you feel, but on what has already been established spiritually. When you start living on that level, something changes profoundly. The mind ceases to be a disorganized battlefield and becomes an aligned territory, where thoughts are filtered, decisions are made, and truth occupies the central place. And in that place you finally understand that you were not born to live hostage to your mind, but to govern it with clarity, firmness, and direction. There is a force that many ignore, but that sustains the mind in the most difficult moments: spiritual joy. Not that superficial joy, which depends on good news or favorable circumstances, but a deep joy, which remains even when everything around is not as it should be. Because when that joy is there, the mind finds stability, finds resistance, finds strength to go on. The problem is that many people condition their joy to what happens outside. If all is well, the mind is light. If something gets out of hand, the joy disappears. And along with it, emotional strength, clarity, motivation goes. The mind begins to weaken, to overload itself, to lose its balance. Because when joy depends on circumstances, it is never constant. But there is a kind of joy that is not born from what happens. It is born from the connection with God. A joy that does not ignore problems, but does not surrender to them. That does not deny reality, but neither does it allow it to determine the inner state. For the joy of the Lord is your strength. Nehemiah 8:10. This statement reveals something profound. Joy is not just a feeling, it is a source of strength, and this force acts directly on the mind. It sustains when everything seems heavy. It lifts when everything tries to knock it down. It holds firm when everything around it generates instability. Perhaps you have experienced moments when, even in the face of difficulties, there was something inside you that remained steadfast, a peace mixed with a lightness, a silent strength that made no logical sense. This is the joy that comes from God. It doesn't depend on explanation, it depends on connection. Controlling the mind also involves accessing this joy. Not to wait for it to come from outside, but to seek it in the presence of God. Because the more you connect, the more that joy becomes real. And the more it gets stronger, the less problems can dominate its thoughts. This doesn't mean you'll never grieve, but it does mean that sadness won't have the final word. There is something greater sustaining you inside, something that keeps your mind steady even when emotions fluctuate. Over time, this joy begins to change the way you see everything. Situations that once seemed unbearable are now faced with more balance. Thoughts that were once heavy begin to lose strength, and the mind finds a new kind of stability, not based on what happens, but on who God is. And it is in this place that you discover a powerful truth. Your strength does not come from how much you can control everything, but from how much you are connected with the one who sustains you in everything. There is an invisible barrier that can completely prevent the transformation of the mind: resistance to truth. Because the problem is not always not knowing the truth, often the problem is not accepting it completely. The human mind has a natural tendency to filter what it hears, to accept what pleases and reject what it confronts. And that's exactly where many remain trapped, even though they have access to what could free them. The truth does not adapt to our interests. It remains firm, regardless of what we feel or think. But when the mind is conditioned by emotions, external pressures, or personal desires, it begins to distort that truth. It starts to interpret partially, to avoid certain parts, to create justifications for not fully aligning itself. There was a moment when someone stood in front of their own truth, face to face, without doubt, without mystery. And yet, his mind could not fully recognize what was before him. The question that came from his lips reveals a deep inner conflict, a mind divided between what he saw and what he was willing to accept. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. John 18:37. This statement shows that truth is not just something that is heard, it is something that is answered. Hearing the truth requires submission, and submission requires giving up internal resistance, formed opinions, interests that are not aligned with God. Controlling the mind also involves this: deciding that the truth will have the final word, even when it confronts, even when it exposes, even when it demands change, because while the mind tries to negotiate with the truth, it remains divided. And a split mind never finds complete peace. Maybe there are areas in your life where you already know what's right, but there's still resistance. Thoughts that try to justify, emotions that try to postpone, reasons that seem convincing. But deep down, there is a silent voice that keeps pointing to the truth, and it is at this point that everything changes. When you decide to stop resisting and start aligning yourself. When you choose not only to listen, but to obey. When it allows the truth to enter completely, without filters, without adaptations. At that moment, the mind begins to organize itself in a different way. The confusion decreases, the clarity increases, and that inner tension begins to disappear. Because now there is no more division, there is alignment. The truth does not come to condemn, it comes to liberate. But this freedom is only manifested when there is complete surrender. When the mind stops fighting against what God has already established and starts to walk in accordance with it. And it is in this place that something profound happens. the mind finds stability, direction, and peace. Not because everything was resolved around you, but because within you everything began to align with that which never changes. By the end of this video, you will feel God's presence in an even deeper way. Stay, because what is being built within you is now about to reach a level that can mark your life definitively. There is a level of transformation that goes beyond controlling thoughts. It goes beyond rejecting what is negative or choosing what is right. It is a level where the very way of thinking begins to change, where the mind stops just reacting better and starts working differently, because the goal is not just to have more control, it's to have a new mind. Many people spend their lives trying to adjust thoughts, correct emotions, organize ideas, but they continue to operate on the same basis, and that is why, even with effort, there is still struggle, there is still instability, there is still internal conflict, because real change doesn't just happen in what you think, but in how you think. There is a powerful promise that reveals this deeper level. We have the mind of Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:16. This is not just a symbolic phrase, it is an available spiritual reality. To have the mind of Christ means to begin to see as he does, to react as he would, to think according to a higher truth. It means that your mind is no longer guided only by human experiences and is influenced by a divine perspective. And that changes everything. Because, in the face of difficult situations, the reaction is no longer impulsive. In the face of conflicts, the answer no longer comes from pride or emotion, but from a different wisdom. In the face of challenges, the mind does not despair. It remains steadfast. This transformation does not happen all at once, but happens progressively as you get closer. Align, surrender. The more you connect with God, the more your mind begins to reflect who He is. And what was once difficult to control begins to be naturally adjusted. You begin to realize that thoughts that once dominated you no longer have the same effect. Reactions that were previously automatic begin to be replaced, and little by little, your mind is being molded from the inside out. It doesn't mean you stop being who you are, but it does mean you start living at a higher level, a level where your thoughts are no longer guided only by what you feel, but by what God reveals. Where your mind is no longer a constant battlefield, but a place of alignment. And at that point, everything starts to make sense. Each step, each learning, each adjustment. Everything was leading you to this place, a place where your mind not only works better, but reflects something bigger. This is the ultimate transformation, not just a controlled mind, but a mind that is renewed, aligned, connected with heaven. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. Do you feel that this word came at the right time? Then receive that confirmation in faith. Comment below, "I believe, Lord," and declare that you are ready to live this new reality in your mind. Everything that has been revealed so far is not just knowledge. It is an invitation, a call to leave the understanding and enter into the surrender. Because there comes a time when it is no longer enough to understand, it is necessary to surrender. The mind may even have been directed, it may have been confronted, adjusted, strengthened, but now she needs to rest in God. You need to stop trying to control everything on your own and allow Him to take over the complete government. True transformation happens when what you've heard becomes something you deliver. When thoughts are no longer just organized and start to be placed before God. It is in this place that the mind finds a deeper rest, one that comes not from effort, but from trust. Trust in Him, O people, at all times. Pour out your heart before Him. Psalm 62:8. There is a clear invitation at this moment. Pour, surrender, open the heart without reservation. Do not keep, do not hide, do not try to solve it alone. Because God doesn't just want you to understand, He wants you to trust. Now is the time to silence everything around and also within you. Leave aside distractions, worries, thoughts that insist on running, and simply put yourself before God with sincerity. Let's go into prayer, allowing Him to touch your mind, organize your thoughts, and establish a peace that only He can give. Beloved Father, your word promises us that there is a peace that goes beyond anything the mind can understand, a peace that guards the heart and thoughts, and it is before this truth that we stand now, recognizing that we need you more than anything. Lord, we thank you for every teaching revealed, for every word that reached our minds and touched our interiors. Thank you that you have not left us lost in our own thoughts, but have shown us that there is a path of transformation, renewal, and control through your presence. Thank you that even when our minds were confused, restless, or tired, the Lord remained faithful, leading us to this moment. Now, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom. It teaches us to live everything we learn. Give us discernment to identify thoughts that do not come from you, courage to reject that which leads us away from your truth, and faith to stand firm even as the mind tries to return to old patterns. Help us to develop a mind aligned with you, a mind that is steadfast, renewed, and filled with your light. Lord, we place before you all areas of our life. Those who are facing emotional battles, who feel anxiety, fear, or confusion, may your peace now reach every thought and bring order where there is disorder. Those who carry painful memories, past wounds, or silent traumas, deeply touch and heal every area of the mind and heart. Those who are going through financial, family, or spiritual difficulties, open paths, restore relationships, and strengthen faith. At this moment, in silence, each one presents before you what he needs most, what no one else sees, what weighs inside his mind and heart. Receive, Lord, every request, every tear, every hidden thought. Father, we completely surrender our mind into your hands. We surrender our thoughts, our emotions, our worries, and even what we can't control. Assume total government of our interior. May our mind no longer be a place of confusion, but a place of peace. May it not be dominated by fear, but guided by faith. May it not be led by lies, but grounded in your truth. And may your promise be fulfilled in us, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. May this peace now invade every mind, bringing rest, clarity, and security. We trust in you. We surrender everything to you, and we declare that from this day our mind belongs to you. In Jesus' name, amen. If this prayer spoke to you in a profound way, write in the comments Amen and declare this surrender as a milestone in your life. Along this journey, you have realized that mind control is not just a human endeavor. It is a profound teaching that God has revealed from the beginning. Each part showed that the mind is the place where everything begins, where battles are won or lost, where faith is strengthened or weakened. God teaches you how to control your mind not with empty theories, but with living principles, capable of completely transforming the way you think, feel, and react. And maybe now you're noticing something different inside you, as if pieces that were previously loose are starting to fall into place. This message is for you, not by chance, but because God has chosen you to hear it today. The question that remains is simple, but profound. What are you going to do with everything you have received so far? Will you continue to allow your mind to dominate you, or will you decide, from this day forward, to surrender it completely to God's control? I am very happy to know that we are together on this journey, really. There's something special going on here, and you're a part of it. I want to invite you, with all affection, to leave your like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, because that way you don't miss any word that can strengthen your faith. But more than that, I want to meet you. Tell me here in the comments where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters, Your life has value, and together we can create a chain of faith where one strengthens the other in prayer. And it doesn't end there. In fact, this is just the beginning. In the next video, you'll understand something even deeper about how to live daily in God's presence and keep your mind aligned even on the toughest days. There is a next step waiting for you, a continuity that can take your spiritual life to a level that you may never have experienced before. Don't ignore this moment, because it can be the key to something you've been seeking for a long time. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.